Welcome to the January wrap-up of all the books that I read in the month of January. I'm really excited because I finally got out of my reading slump this month and I found some of the best books I've ever read. Like legit, some of these books are just top tier, some of my favorite books that I've ever read in the past like 3 or 4 years or so. So good. Let's just get into it. So I ended up reading 10 books this month, which was a huge improvement from the month of December where I could barely read one and it was a reread because that was all that my brain could handle. So we are already looking at a great start for the year. That being said, all of these books I actually read in the last 2 weeks of January, and 3 I read January 30th. So we are like slowly getting back into our reading groove. But I promise you, these books, if you are in a reading slump, these books will get you out of it. I 100% promise you. So out of the 10 books that I read, 4 were audiobooks, which we kind of talked about in the last video. I highly recommend getting into the audiobook scene if you are struggling reading, if you are struggling to get back into reading. Audiobooks are an excellent way to do that. And speaking of which, the first book of the year that I read was also an audiobook, and that was The Lightning Thief, the first book of the Percy Jackson series. I am currently rereading the series because of the show that's coming out, but also I really wanted to reconnect with all of the books that I loved in my childhood. I'm potentially doing a video about that. So the first series that I am reading to kind of get back into my childhood books are the Percy Jackson series, because as an undiagnosed ADHD girl, when I was younger, those books, were the most relatable to me. And thankfully we are here, we are diagnosed, we have stuff that are helping us with ADHD, but it's so funny rereading the book now because I'm like, oh my gosh, no wonder I love these books so much. It was representation and I didn't even know it. But that being said, if you don't know, the Percy Jackson series is a Greek mythology retelling where a group of demigods go to a Camp Half-Blood and go on a multitude of different adventures to save the world a multitude of different times, but it's all in the Greek mythology lens. So it is a YA fantasy kind of more Greek retelling book series that I adored when I was younger, and so I again continued reading it this year. There were a few things that I was just like, I don't really know if I like that much, but the majority of it was still so good. It's super fast-paced, super fun. One of the best audiobooks I've read in a really long time. The narrator was fantastic. And all in all, it was just a fun time. I loved jumping back into the universe with Percy Jackson and with Annabeth and with Grover. I felt like the scenes were still super funny and fun and exciting. And it does a really great job at explaining like what Greek myths are through reading, especially if you have like no knowledge whatsoever. It does an excellent job of like catching you up to speed because you are similar to Percy in that way where you don't know anything, and so you're being caught up to speed. And it's just a really fun time, and I can't wait to eventually continue the series, but I got into some other books that I absolutely loved. January was also a huge month for poetry for me, and that all started with Soft Science. This book, oh my goodness, this reintroduced poetry to me in such a unique and creative and fun way. It explores the ideas of femininity while also adding this entire new sci-fi element to it, to like the poetry aspect, and it is just so cool and so fun, and it just makes so much sense. It deals a lot with queerness, with being feminine, with being specifically an Asian American woman as well, and I feel like a lot of that goes so well with the idea of being like a cyborg, of trying to fit in with humanity. When you are queer, as someone who is bisexual, I felt this a lot growing up in high school, you just feel like you don't fit in, and you want to appear like you are exactly like the rest of your peers, and you just can't. And one of my favorite poems is literally the first poem in the book. It's called Turing Test. Yes, she actually recreates a Turing test in poetry. Oh my goodness, my little sci-fi brain was freaking out when I opened that. But it just goes through and it just really talks about the like weird bits and pieces of fitting in and being seen as like different, seen as other, seen as not quite human in a lot of ways. And I just feel like if you're a part of any group that is ostracized, you're gonna understand this book and you're gonna love this poetry. If you loved the video game Detroit Become Human, please read this book. Like, my video game senses, like this perfectly captured what that story was also trying to tell. So highly recommend. It's super, super short. It's 100 pages, but it's so cool. And if you are wanting to get into poetry, this is it. Because as an English major, I had to read a lot of poetry and I was kind of tired. I was tired of Byron. I was tired of Shakespeare, believe it or not. I wanted something unique and interesting, and this was it. And this got me right back into loving poetry again, and I'm so happy for it. The next book that I read was The Fall of Whit Rivera. This is a YA romance, and it is so cute. If you are wanting to jump right back into the nostalgia of fall, if you're missing that when it's like freezing outside, this is the book for you. It's so warm, it's so sweet and heartfelt, and I have never felt more seen as an oldest daughter with chronic pain. You know, Whit Rivera, Whit gets me. She understands the oldest daughter problems. I loved this book. I thought it was so cute. The romance was adorable, but let's get into the plot. So of course the book follows Whit Rivera as she's entering her senior year in high school, but she has a lot of things going wrong. First, she just discovered that she has PCOS, and so she's trying to uncover what that means and also how to cope with all of the changes that are happening with her body and all of the changes that are happening when you realize that you have a chronic illness. It's intense, but completely relatable in so many ways. She also just broke up with her long-term boyfriend. Sad, but we had to get there. This is a romance book, ladies and gents. And while she's the president of creating the Fall Fest for her school, her ex happens to be the one that she is working with in order to get this Fall Fest to happen. Yes. It is kind of a enemies to lovers in the sense that it's like a second chance romance type of vibe, and it's high school, so there's that. But that is the premise of this book. So she is trying to kind of come into herself, be more confident in herself after discovering that she has this chronic illness. She's trying to learn how to love again. She's trying to set up everything for the Fall Fest, which is so stressful and so big and intense. But it all works out, and it is so cute and adorable. I keep saying that, but I promise you will love this book. If you love just a light, heartfelt romance, this is just so fun and so warm and so cozy. And again, as someone who experiences chronic pain, I related so hard to it when you are working nonstop and sometimes your body will shut down. It will tell you, no, absolutely not, you went too hard, so we're shutting down. And that is so hard, especially as like a high schooler, to recognize like you have to listen to your body and you have to take days off when you don't want to and when you're missing fun things, and that's so hard, but it's so relatable. And chronic illness does not mean that you cannot have joy and love and fun in your life, and this book perfectly explains that. Just because you have a chronic illness does not exclude you from all the fun things life has to offer. So, highly recommend giving this book a read. It's incredible. I cannot wait to read more from this author. She has 2 other books, and her writing style just sold me. It was incredible. Oh, I can't stop raving about this book, y'all. It was so good. The next book that I read was another audiobook, and that was Minor Detail. This was a pretty short audiobook. It was only about 3 hours and 50 minutes, so fairly short, especially with my like 3 times speed listening. But it was, I think, the best book that I read in the entirety of January. So the book follows a young Palestinian woman as she is trying to uncover what happened to another Palestinian woman in an article that she found. The reason she's so connected to trying to find this woman is because in the article, the woman died on the same day that the main character was born. And so the minor detail of them being connected in that very slight, small way leads her to go on this journey through Palestine, through Israel, of trying to discover what this woman's story was. Who was she? What was her name? And it's heartbreaking. I'm not gonna lie, it is heartbreaking, but so necessary. It's one of the most important stories that I've ever read. It needed to be told, and it was incredible. One of the best writing styles I've ever read. It was so impactful, so moving. I was so entrenched in the story. I just wanted to just eat it up, but it was, again, heartbreaking. This is not an easy story, but again, necessary. It does an excellent job showing how Palestine changed and how the occupied forces of Israel affect Palestinians day to day to day, and how despite there being peace in this story, there isn't peace. That doesn't really exist for a Palestinian when you are living under a military occupation. It does an excellent job describing that. It shows the stolen lands and how they were changed and how villages became empty, desolate parks that weren't even being used. It's so eye-opening to just understand, that's what it's like. That's the world there. And shows how difficult the military checkpoints are, how difficult it is to move from one place to another as a Palestinian. Again, it does an excellent job at describing what life is like living under this military occupation. And it's so impactful. That's the best word I can use to describe it. It's so good, so impactful. It's really short. I highly recommend giving it a read, especially if you are trying to do the work in educating yourself. This is the book to read, 100%, to fully understand how it feels to live under an occupation like this. It's not fun. It is not fun. It's scary. You are overthinking every single step you make. Yeah, it's an excellent book. Highly, highly recommend. Do read trigger warnings before you pick it up because, there are things that will be traumatizing while reading it. But it's so good, and please, please, out of all of the books that I've read this month, that is the book that you need to read. 100%. Read that book. The next book that I read was Rifqa. This is my second poetry collection of this month. Like I told you, soft science, it got me into that poetry scene again, and I'm so pumped for it. But Rifqa is a poetry collection that specifically talks about the Palestinian resistance movement, and it's just excellent. And I think it was his debut novel, which a debut poetry collection being this good, it's wow, just wow. One of my favorite poems was the poem about boys playing soccer on the beach and they were attacked, and it describes just the anger and frustration that comes when Palestinians are having joy and this occupation is stealing that away from them. There is this joy of being Palestinian and being someone that comes from such a rich cultural heritage, and it is being taken away by these people. And so it does an excellent job at describing those feelings in ways that make sense to the reader. You feel those feelings along with him as he's writing. You feel that. And I think one of the major things that this poetry collection is trying to bring across is, reading this is great, taking action is better. So it really pushes you to rethink your own biases towards everything that is happening while also making you take action, do the things, call your reps, protest, do the stuff that needs to happen. It's an excellent poetry collection, one of the most moving poetry collections I've ever read, and again, it's his debut novel. So amazing, incredible, one of the best poets I've ever read. The next book was my third poetry collection of the month, and it was also my very first ARC. Yay! I finally got an ARC. I'm really excited about it. Obviously all of these opinions are still my own, but it was fun. It was very exciting to read something and also read something from another incredible Palestinian poet. So the book was The Moon That Turns You Back, and this poetry collection was specifically dealing with displacement and how that feels, what that does to a person, how that affects the memories of not only oneself but one's family, and it breaks it down in the most creative way that I've ever seen from a poet. Some of these poems, I was just like, that's so smart, and that so accurately describes what displacement feels like, and I don't know how you put that on a page. Like, what? Some of my favorite poems out of this entire collection were choose your own adventure-esque poems, where you would start the poem would begin, and then she would give you 3 options of 3 different words to continue the poem. And depending on what word you chose, the poem completely shifted and went a different direction. Almost like depending on where you are living, where you move to, what happens, your story completely shifts and changes. And it was so cool. If anything, I highly recommend pre-ordering this book just to see the creativity on display, because I was blown away. Like, this poetry collection, top tier, one of the, again, most creative collections I've ever seen. It was just so cool to see, and I am like, I'm never gonna get there, but I'm really glad that I can read someone who is there. So highly recommend pre-ordering this book. It comes out on March 12th, I believe, and again, just 100 pages. It's a pretty, like, average size poetry collection, but so cool, so unique. It was just, wow, incredible, amazing. I'm telling you guys, like, this month, January, was just the month for me. It really hit, and all of these books were 4 to 5 stars, which is crazy. I don't have months like that, and I'm just... Okay, let's move on. The next book I read was another audiobook. This one was about 10 hours and 44 minutes long, and that was Something More. This book was so good, guys. I know I have something about everyone, but oh my goodness. This book follows a 15-year-old Palestinian-Canadian young teenager as she is entering her first year of high school. The catch is she also had recently discovered that she is autistic, so she's dealing with all of those conflicting emotions of getting a diagnosis, understanding what's going on, but also kind of, the fear of, well, this is what that means, and people look at you differently because you're neurodivergent. All those conflicting feelings are addressed in this book. And she also has a little bit of a love triangle happening. It's fun, it's cute. I was screaming and giggling and stressing, and all of the emotions came out while listening to this book, quite literally. It was just an incredible book. It was so fun, and I've never felt more seen while reading a book. The author put it really great in a TikTok the other day. I follow her. She's incredible. Please follow her on TikTok. She's top tier. But just the fact that this is something that I think young me would have loved to read, and I'm really happy that I'm reading it now because I think it's healing some parts to me that felt just broken from my own experience as a neurodivergent woman in high school. There's lots of things. You miss social cues, you miss things, and it's really hard when you're undiagnosed in high school and you just don't understand what's going on. And of course, obviously, being autistic and having ADHD, very, very different experiences. I'm not trying to take away from that, but I do feel like there's a lot of similarities between just being a neurodivergent woman and the experiences that those entail. But I just love this book. I felt so seen. I related, like it was me in high school. Like that is how little 15-year-old Michaela acted as well. And yeah, it healed something in my heart. It was so cute. I loved the ending. I was so happy. It took me a few days to want to read another book because I just wanted to sit in the joy that I felt after finishing this one because it was just so good. And I highly recommend listening to the audiobook because a lot of the book is, you know, the internal feelings of this main character, this young girl, and I feel like it impacted me so much more because it was like I was hearing my own internal dialogue. So it was really great. Highly recommend the audiobook, but also just highly recommend picking this book up because wow, I can't wait for this author to write more books because she's just so good, and having an autistic author writing about just such joyful moments is just incredible, and again, healed something in my heart, so highly recommend. So these next 3 books, I actually read all on the same day. I read all of them January 30th because I was just in a reading mood. Sometimes, you know, the hyperfixation hits you and you go along with it. So reading hyperfixation clicked on January 30th. I read all day. But the first book I read was The Wind Knows My Name. This is a historical fiction, and it deals with the effects of immigration, particularly the effects of immigration on children and displacement on children. And so it goes through multitudes of different people and their immigration stories. We have 2 stories from El Salvador from 2 different women who are traveling through multiple different things to get to the United States to escape what the United States was doing in El Salvador, let's just be honest. Also has a story of a young Jewish boy escaping Nazi Germany while that was all happening, and eventually all of these stories of really hard experiences have a really incredible, succinct, happy ending, and they all combine together. All of these different POVs perfectly mesh into one around like the last 2 chapters, and it was really, really awesome. I will say, for someone who has ADHD, I had a really hard time with the jumping between POVs so frequently. I think my like task switching wasn't working when I was reading this book, and so I'd be like, wow, okay, I'm going into this new story now, I need to forget what I was just reading, and so it took me a really long time to finish this book. It's only 250 pages. It took me like 8 hours to really get through the whole thing, which is not like me at all. So for that reason, there were parts of this book that I was having a little bit of a hard time enjoying, despite the fact that I was enjoying it, if that makes sense. It just, my brain wasn't connecting with how the book was set up. That being said, the ending made a lot of the struggle worth it. It did end very nicely and succinctly, and all the POVs did come together in a very beautiful way, but getting there was a little difficult for my brain. And that, of course, is probably just me and how my brain works, but that being said, there are a lot of POVs that you will have to keep track of. All the stories are very interesting, but it does jump around quite a bit. So just a warning for all of those who are similar to me and have a hard time like task switching in that way. The next book was What Moves the Dead. I've heard so much about the Sworn Soldier series, and I'm so glad that I picked it up finally because wow, it was so good and intense, and I haven't felt that reading a horror book in a really long time. But let's get into it. So What Moves the Dead is about a sworn soldier. It's kind of a fantasy book, so there are fantastical elements and a fantastical world, and it is a fantasy version of Europe, kind of around the time of like World War II, like just after that, so to speak, kind of in that area of history, but it's all fantasy, so it's different. But there is this sworn soldier of Alex, who is a like non-binary soldier, and they were asked to join their old friends, the Ushers, because their friend Maddie might be dying. So this is in fact a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe. We love it. It's a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher in particular, and I love a good Edgar Allan Poe retelling. I think they are the perfect horror stories for a multitude of different reasons, and I just love it when you can add something new and fresh to the story, and having like this fantasy world and like mushroom-esque elements are so cool. So obviously it's a horror-esque story. There's mystery, there's intrigue, there's a little bit of like mushroom horror, which we love. We love a good fungi horror. And it's really, really funny because it reminded me a lot of Mexican Gothic, which if you have not read that book, please do. It's incredible. And upon reading the author's note, the author panicked because they were just about to finish this story and send it off to a publisher when Mexican Gothic was released. So they had just finished the story and then that story was released and they're like, oh my gosh, it's an Edgar Allan Poe retelling with mushrooms and a house. And it's very, very similar in that way, but it's different in a lot of ways. And I really love the story of Alex and their complicated history, and obviously the world itself is really, really fascinating. I love it. So if you have read Mexican Gothic, you will see a lot of similarities, but I promise it's worth it. It's such a good book. And if you have read What Moves the Dead and you want another story that's similar, read Mexican Gothic. They are very similar, but they're different in a multitude of different ways. It was just funny upon reading it when I was like, this reminds me a lot of Mexican Gothic. Like, I'm getting really similar vibes, and the author even mentioned that in their author notes, so that was just so funny to me. But either way, I absolutely enjoyed this book. I felt the spookies, which again is kind of hard for me to feel when it comes to like thriller and horror books, so that was a plus. And it's also a very short read. It's only like 150 pages. Didn't take me that long. I was super invested. I was flipping through. It's super fast paced. And yeah, I just loved it. It was great and unique and cool and spooky, and anything that has to do with like spooky mushroom stuff, you got me. I'm sold. That being said, the next book that I read was Sworn Soldier 2, which is another arc that I got. This is like the month of arcs, y'all. I'm so pumped about it. Again, all the opinions are my own, but I read What Feast at Night, and I read this through the audiobook, which was great. I think the narrator did an excellent job. I was a little nervous because I had just read the book like physically, and so jumping to an audiobook in the same story, I was nervous what that was gonna do, but it was great. I absolutely loved the audiobook. But that being said, What Feast at Night is another story about Alex, and they go to their family hunting lodge after the events of the first book, and more crazy, creepy stuff happens. This one in particular was kind of a werewolf meets fairy vibe, and it was so cool. I've never heard anything like this. I'm sure it is a folktale somewhere, but it seemed really unique to me while reading it, and it was scarier than the first book. So if you have read What Moves the Dead and you loved how scary it was, this one was scarier. This one really spooked me. Like, I was looking behind, I was making sure that no one was following me, and when I went to bed that night, I was spooked for sure. I won't get into, again, like the specifics of the tale itself, but let me tell you, you will get spooked. It is same old Alex. Wonderful, kind of a little slow to figuring out what's going on, but that's, you know, completely perfect for like a skeptic, you know. And I loved the new characters that were introduced in this. The housekeeper was incredible. Her son, oh my goodness, I loved him so much. And I loved the interactions that they all had together. It was so much more impactful, I think, than the first book, because I didn't feel as connected to Maddie or Roderick because they're, you know, characters in another story. This one, I felt much more invested in all these other characters' stories. Like, I was rooting for everyone. So it was really nice, and I really enjoyed it. So again, if you loved What Moves the Dead, you're gonna love this book. I think it's way better, and that's saying something because I loved the first book so much. That being said, I think that What Feast at Night comes out February 13th. So make sure you pre-order it, make sure it is on your list because it is so good and it brings all of the spooky, creepy feelings while also having a really fun, like, found family, heartfelt moment. So loved it. Those are all 10 books that I read in January. I am so impressed that I read 10 books. I was only expecting to read one, to be honest. So this is a good month, a good way to start the year. I'd love to hear what books that y'all read this month, what you love to read, because I'm always down for new recommendations. I am very excited for February. I really wanted to focus on fantasy in February, and I have so many incredible fantasy books by Black authors that I've been just really wanting to read, and this is just like the moment because my library had all of them in stock. Let's go. So I have so many books that I want to read, and I'm in the reading spirit. I'm in the reading mode. I'm hoping that this lasts because I tend to fluctuate back and forth. That is the little ADHD brain, but I'm very excited. I think February is going to be an excellent month. If you have any fantasy book recs, let me know, because that is going to be kind of my focus this next month. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you are new here, this is probably an awkward time for me to be introducing myself, but my name is Michaela. We do a lot of bookish things on here. We do a lot of like D&D-esque things on here, and we talk about ADHD brains. So if that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to subscribe. I post every Friday, and I post shorts every now and then as well. So I'm on here pretty frequently, and I'd love to kind of grow our little fun community that we have here of just loving book people. So yeah, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you all next week. Bye.